Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow and a little unusual, something soft and gently curious. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now maybe dim the lights, pull the blanket a little closer, and allow your mind to drift just a bit, because tonight we are going to wander through a very old and very human habit. The quiet search for feeling different, for stepping slightly outside the ordinary. Without modern science, without laboratories, without neat little labels, ancient peoples still found ways to relax, to escape, and to change how they felt. And as it turns out, they were quite creative about it. So let us begin slowly. Long before cities grew tall, and before written history had much to say, humans were already experimenting with the plants around them, not in a dramatic or chaotic way, but in a slow, accidental process, one that unfolded over thousands of years. Imagine a small group of early humans sitting near a fire somewhere deep in a forest or on the edge of a wide plain. The air is cool, the night is long, and food is simple, maybe roots, maybe roasted meat, and someone, somewhere, notices that a certain plant, when eaten or burned, changes something just slightly. Maybe it makes the body feel lighter or heavier. Maybe it softens the edges of thought or makes the stars look just a little brighter. And because humans are curious and also a bit stubborn, that plant is tried again and again, because of course it is. This is how much of early discovery worked. Not through careful planning, but through quiet repetition and a willingness to keep going even when the results were a little strange. Some plants made people sleepy, which was useful after a long day of hunting or walking. Some plants made people feel calm, which was helpful in a world that was often uncertain and occasionally dangerous. And some plants simply made people feel different in a way that was hard to explain, but apparently interesting enough to keep using. Over time, these experiences became part of daily life, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, almost background way, like adding a small detail to a much larger picture. Let us drift gently into one of the earliest known examples, ancient civilizations in the region that is now known as Mesopotamia, a place where early cities began to form and where peoples started writing things down, which was helpful for historians much later. The people there were familiar with a plant that produced a substance known as opium, though of course they did not call it that at the time. For them, it was simply a useful part of their environment, something that could ease pain and bring a sense of calm and perhaps a bit of distance from the more difficult parts of life. And life back then had quite a few difficult parts. This substance was not used recklessly, at least not in the way we might imagine today. It was often tied to rituals or healing practices, used by early healers who probably did not have formal training but did have experience, which sometimes works just as well. They would prepare it carefully and administer it in small amounts, enough to soothe but not overwhelm, because even in ancient times, people understood that too much of a good thing could become a problem, though of course that lesson was learned slowly and sometimes the hard way. Now let us move a little further east to ancient India, where the relationship between humans and mind-altering plants took on a slightly more philosophical tone. Here, substances were often tied to spiritual practices rather than simple relaxation, though the line was probably quite thin. One of the most well-known substances in this region was derived from the cannabis plant, though again it was not viewed in the same way we might view it today. It was often associated with religious rituals, particularly those connected to certain deities and practices. It was believed to help the mind focus, or perhaps drift in a controlled way, allowing for deeper meditation or a sense of connection that was otherwise difficult to achieve. And while that might sound very intentional and structured, the reality was likely a mix of careful use and occasional overindulgence, because humans tend to be consistent in that regard across time. There are texts from ancient India that describe these substances in almost poetic terms, speaking of their ability to lift the mind or ease the burdens of the body, which suggests that people were not only using them, but also thinking quite deeply about their effects, which is both impressive and very human. Now let us move slowly into ancient China, where early herbal practices developed into something quite detailed and systematic. Chinese scholars and healers cataloged a wide range of plants, noting their effects on the body and mind with careful observation. Among these were plants that could alter perception or mood, though they were usually framed within the context of balance and harmony rather than escape. The goal was not to leave reality behind, but to adjust it slightly, to bring the body and mind into alignment. Which sounds very calm and reasonable, and also a bit ambitious, because maintaining balance is not always easy, especially when human emotions are involved. Still, these substances were used with a sense of purpose, often in controlled settings and guided by individuals who had spent years learning about their effects, which probably helped reduce the number of unfortunate outcomes, though certainly did not eliminate them entirely. Because again, humans are humans. Now, as we continue this slow journey, it becomes clear that ancient people were not wildly different from us in their desires. They wanted relief from pain. They wanted moments of calm. They wanted to feel something other than the constant demands of daily life. And so they turned to what they had available: plants, roots, flowers, and sometimes fermented drinks that developed almost by accident. Ah yes, fermentation, one of the most widespread and quietly influential discoveries in human history. At some point, someone noticed that certain fruits or grains, when left alone for a while, began to change. They produced a liquid that had a noticeable effect when consumed. At first, this was probably a bit surprising, perhaps even slightly alarming, but eventually it became familiar, and then quite popular. Because of course it did. Ancient societies across the world developed their own forms of fermented beverages, whether it was early beer in Mesopotamia, or rice wine in Asia, or various fruit-based drinks in other regions. These beverages were not just for celebration, they were part of daily life, often safer to drink than water, and also more interesting in terms of taste and effect. People would gather, share stories, and slowly sip these drinks, allowing the mild effects to settle in, creating a sense of warmth and relaxation that made the long days feel a little shorter, and the nights a little softer. Now, it is important to remember that these experiences were generally mild compared to what modern substances can produce. The goal was not intensity, but subtlety, a gentle shift rather than a dramatic leap. Which is perhaps why they fit so naturally into daily routines without causing too much disruption. Though again, not always. There were certainly moments when things went a bit too far, when someone consumed more than intended and had to deal with the consequences the next day, which were likely just as unpleasant then as they are now. Some things never change. As we continue drifting through this quiet history, it becomes clear that the human desire to alter consciousness is not a modern invention. It is something that has been present for as long as humans have had the ability to observe and experiment. But what is perhaps more interesting is the way this desire was expressed, not through excess or chaos, but through slow, careful integration into daily life, into rituals, into social gatherings, and into moments of rest. It was not about escaping reality entirely, but about softening it just enough to make it more manageable, and maybe a little more interesting. So, as the night settles in and the world grows quieter, we can see that ancient people were not so different from us, sitting by their fires, holding their simple cups or small bundles of dried plants, looking for a moment of calm, a brief shift in perspective, a gentle way to end the day. And in that sense, the story is not strange at all. It is simply human. And we will continue this slow journey together as we drift further into the quiet and curious ways ancient people shaped their experiences, one small discovery at a time. As the quiet night continues, and the air feels just a little softer, we can gently drift forward into the world of ancient Greece, where life was filled with philosophy, long conversations, and, of course, a steady curiosity about the limits of the human mind. The Greeks had a habit of thinking deeply about almost everything, which meant that when it came to substances that could alter mood or perception, they did not simply use them, they discussed them, they debated them, and occasionally they turned them into entire philosophical problems, because of course they did. Wine was perhaps the most common and socially accepted way to relax in ancient Greece, but it was not consumed in the same way we might imagine today. It was usually diluted with water, which might sound a bit disappointing at first, but was actually considered the proper and civilized way to drink. Drinking undiluted wine was often seen as excessive or even a bit barbaric, which is a polite way of saying people would quietly judge you. And yet, even with diluted wine, the Greeks understood very well that it could shift the mood, soften the mind, and make long conversations feel a little easier. Symposia were gatherings where people would recline on couches, share food and drink, and engage in slow, thoughtful discussions that could last for hours, sometimes drifting from serious topics into more relaxed and slightly unfocused territory as the night went on, which feels very familiar. There was also a sense of structure to these gatherings, a kind of unspoken agreement that the experience should remain balanced, not too sober and not too chaotic, a gentle middle ground where the mind could wander but not completely lose its way. Of course, this balance was not always maintained, and there were certainly evenings where things became a bit more lively than intended, but overall, the goal was moderation. At least in theory. Now, alongside wine, the Greeks were also aware of other substances, though they were often tied to more specific contexts. One of the more mysterious examples comes from the Eleusinian Mysteries, a set of religious rites that were practiced over many years and involved a drink known as kykeon. The exact contents of this drink are still debated, but many believe it may have contained naturally occurring compounds that could alter perception in subtle ways. Participants in these rites would undergo a carefully guided experience, one that was meant to be meaningful and transformative rather than simply recreational. It was not about escaping reality, but about seeing it from a slightly different angle, perhaps gaining insight or a sense of connection that was otherwise difficult to reach. And while we cannot know exactly what they experienced, it is clear that these practices were taken very seriously and were surrounded by a sense of quiet respect, which is quite different from the more casual use of substances in other settings. Now, let us slowly move westward into ancient Rome, where things become both familiar and slightly more excessive. The Romans inherited much of their cultural habits from the Greeks, including the use of wine, but as with many things, they tended to take it just a little further. Roman banquets were known for their abundance, large quantities of food, long hours of reclining, and of course, plenty of wine, often flowing more freely than in the more restrained Greek gatherings. Because if something is enjoyable, why not extend it a bit? Or a lot? Wine in Rome was still often diluted, but not always, and the social expectations around drinking could vary depending on the setting and the individuals involved. Some preferred a calm and balanced evening, while others were more inclined toward indulgence. And as one might expect, both approaches had their consequences. Beyond wine, the Romans also made use of various herbal mixtures, some of which were intended for relaxation, while others were more medicinal in nature, though again, the distinction was not always clear. A plant that eased pain might also bring a sense of calm, and a drink that relaxed the body might also be used during social gatherings. Everything was slightly interconnected. Roman physicians documented many of these substances, describing their effects with a level of detail that suggests careful observation, even if their understanding of the underlying mechanisms was limited. They knew what worked, even if they did not fully understand why, which is a recurring theme in human history. There is also something quietly interesting about the Roman approach to leisure, The idea that after a long day of responsibilities, it was perfectly acceptable to unwind with a drink or a calming preparation. This was not seen as unusual or controversial, but simply part of life, a way to ease the transition from activity to rest. And if that sounds familiar, then yes, it is. Now, as we continue drifting through this slow landscape, we can notice a pattern beginning to form across different cultures and regions. The use of substances was rarely about intensity or escape in the dramatic sense, but rather about adjustment, a small shift in feeling, a gentle softening of the edges. People were not looking to completely change their reality, they were simply looking to make it a little more comfortable, a little more manageable. Let us now move slightly north and into the world of early European tribes, where written records are more limited, but where archaeological evidence gives us quiet hints about daily life. These communities also engaged in fermentation, creating early forms of beer and other beverages from grains and fruits. The process was simple but effective, and over time it became a stable part of their routine. The drinks were often mild in strength, but still capable of producing a gentle sense of relaxation, particularly when consumed in a social setting, around a fire, or during seasonal gatherings. There is something deeply human about this image. People sitting together, sharing a simple drink, allowing the conversation to slow and the mind to drift just a little. No urgency, no pressure, just a shared moment of calm. In some regions, there is also evidence of plant use that may have had mild psychoactive effects, though these were often tied to specific traditions or rituals rather than everyday use. Again, the theme returns: balance, intention, and a certain level of caution. Because even without modern science, people understood that these substances had power, and that power needed to be respected. At least, most of the time. Of course, there were always individuals who pushed the limits, who consumed more than was wise or experimented in ways that did not end particularly well, but those stories tend to fade into the background, leaving us with a general picture of careful and gradual use. Now, as we continue this quiet journey, it becomes clear that ancient people were engaged in a kind of slow, ongoing experiment, one that spanned generations and regions, each culture adding its own observations and practices to the collective understanding. There was no central authority, no universal guide, just a shared human tendency to explore, to notice, and to remember what seemed to work. And over time, this created a body of knowledge that was surprisingly rich, even if it was not formally organized. People knew which plants to use, which ones to avoid, and how to prepare them in ways that produced the desired effect. This knowledge was passed down through stories, through traditions, and through simple observation, and it became part of the rhythm of daily life. So, as the night continues and your thoughts begin to settle, we can see that the ancient world was not a place of constant intensity or wild experimentation, but rather a landscape of quiet adjustments, small choices, and gentle explorations. People found ways to relax, to cope, and to shift their perspective using what was available to them in ways that were often subtle and integrated into the flow of their lives. And in that sense, the story continues to feel very familiar, just a little slower, a little quieter, and perhaps a little more patient. And we'll keep drifting forward through this calm and curious history, seeing how these early practices slowly evolved and spread, shaping the way humans understood not just the world around them, but the experience of being within it. As the night deepens and the world outside grows even quieter, let us drift slowly across the oceans to the ancient civilizations of the Americas, where people also found ways to gently alter perception without the benefits of modern drugs. We can picture long stretches of land dotted with small settlements and larger cities, people working slowly in the fields, children playing near rivers, and elders quietly observing the rhythms of the day. Amid all of this, humans were experimenting, as always, with what the natural world had provided. In Mesoamerica, the Olmecs, the Mayans, and later the Aztecs all engaged with substances that could slightly alter the mind. One of the most notable was cacao, which was far from the sweet chocolate we know today. It was bitter, sometimes fermented, and often consumed in a ritualized way, blended with spices and water. The drink produced a subtle boost of energy, a gentle shift in mood, and sometimes a slight heightened awareness, which was ideal for ceremonies and long discussions. It was a way of gently stretching the mind without leaving the comfort of the day behind. In addition to cacao, there were other plants used with more noticeable effects. Peyote, a small cactus native to parts of what is now Mexico, was utilized in specific spiritual rituals. Its effects were mild compared to modern hallucinogens, but enough to guide participants into quiet, reflective states. These experiences were highly structured, guided by elders or shamans who understood the plant's rhythms. It wasn't about reckless indulgence, and it wasn't a casual experiment. The objective was subtle insight, introspection, and, in some cases, social cohesion. Because, of course, humans everywhere tend to intertwine social life with relaxation, even in small doses. In the Andes, the Incas and their predecessors cultivated coca leaves not for dramatic highs, but for practical purposes. Chewing coca leaves could alleviate fatigue and hunger and help the body endure long days of labor at high altitudes. The mild stimulant effect was not a party trick, but a slow, careful enhancement of daily life. The leaves were often used in ritualistic contexts as well, forming part of prayers, offerings, and meditative practices. Here, again, we see a quiet consistency, the human mind drawn to gentle shifts in sensation, not chaos, not intensity, just a soft adjustment. Now, if we float across the Atlantic to Africa, a continent of immense diversity and countless traditions, we encounter a similar pattern. Ancient African societies developed a deep understanding of their environment, noting which plants and herbs could calm, energize, or slightly alter perception. Fermentation once again played a critical role. Beer and fermented beverages made from grains and fruits were widespread, often safer to drink than water, and usually mild in effect. Sharing these drinks was as much about social cohesion as it was about altering consciousness, a ritualistic pause in the daily grind, an invitation to slow down and drift gently into conversation. There were also psychoactive plants in Africa, used sparingly, often tied to spiritual or healing practices. The goal was rarely excess. Instead, these substances were integrated into rituals that helped maintain social balance, eased psychological burdens, or gently guided the mind into a different state. Curiosity, observation, and caution defined the approach, not reckless experimentation. Meanwhile, across both continents, the common thread is clear. Humans everywhere sought subtle shifts in perception and mood. The methods varied, the plants were different, the rituals unique, but the underlying motivation was consistent. Life is sometimes difficult, sometimes tedious, and a small adjustment can help ease the journey. Let us drift slowly back to the Mediterranean for a moment to a quieter observation about Greek and Roman practices that had analogs across the globe. In both civilizations, ritualized consumption of substances was almost always embedded in social and religious life. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, or the symposia, the structured feasts of Rome, were designed to offer gentle shifts in awareness rather than wild abandon. The communal experience mattered as much as the substance itself. Humans naturally entwine comfort, curiosity, and community, and ancient people were no exception. In the quiet corners of daily life, individuals experimented on their own, chewing or brewing various herbs, tasting small portions to observe the effects. Children were occasionally present, adults mindful, and experiences integrated into the slow rhythm of life. What emerges is a subtle portrait of humans as careful experimenters, methodical observers of cause and effect, quietly documenting what worked, what soothed, and what distracted. Over generations, these observations became shared knowledge, part of collective memory, and eventually codified in early texts or oral traditions. Turning back to the Americas for a moment, it is notable that many plants used for mild psychoactive effects were often tied to the cycles of agriculture and seasons. The rituals surrounding these substances were slow, predictable, and calming in structure. There was a clear acknowledgement that moderation mattered and that intention guided use. The effect, as gentle as it was, allowed individuals to step slightly outside their ordinary consciousness, perhaps feeling a little lighter, a little more connected, or a little more introspective. This was not hedonism. It was careful, mindful human experimentation across centuries.
In Africa as well, plants with calming or stimulative properties were often incorporated into the slow rhythm of labor and rest. Consider the quiet patterns of harvest and planting seasons, community gatherings at the end of long days, and the subtle use of fermented beverages or herbal infusions to aid the body and mind. These were not casual or reckless indulgences, but part of an integrated understanding of life's pace, human energy, and social cohesion. Humans, it seems, have always wanted to step slightly outside ordinary perception, but they rarely sought to do so violently. Meanwhile, in ancient India and China, this desire became layered with philosophy and observation. The use of cannabis, for example, was tied not only to mild intoxication, but to meditation, spiritual practice, and gentle exploration of consciousness. The mind was encouraged to wander, to float lightly, to step outside ordinary patterns of thought. Similarly, in China, herbal mixtures were designed to balance the body and mind, subtly altering perception without overwhelming the senses. These practices were deeply integrated into social and spiritual life, demonstrating a pattern of careful, slow exploration. Across all these regions, one subtle feature emerges. The human desire to alter consciousness is ancient, ubiquitous, and surprisingly gentle in its earliest expressions. Early people were not looking for a breakneck escape from reality. They were looking for minor adjustments, a gentle drift, a slow expansion of perception that allowed for calm, introspection, and social connection. Even when substances were used for ceremonial or spiritual purposes, the emphasis was on guidance and intention. A shaman, elder, or experienced individual often oversaw consumption. The goal was subtle insight, not chaos. And over centuries, these practices became woven into daily life, seasonal rituals, and spiritual observances. And so, as we continue drifting slowly through time, it becomes evident that early humans everywhere shared a remarkable commonality. Whether in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, Africa, Europe, or Asia, people discovered ways to gently shift their awareness. They observed, experimented, and shared knowledge across generations. These practices were rarely loud, never urgent, and often deeply integrated into the natural rhythm of life. Even the mistakes and overindulgences fade into the background, leaving behind a portrait of humans as slow, deliberate explorers of perception. There is a quiet elegance in this history, a rhythm that mirrors the slow unfolding of life itself. Humans discovered that with a little observation, a touch of care, and a gentle hand, the ordinary day could become slightly softer, slightly more malleable, slightly more manageable. And as you settle further into the calm of your own space, perhaps tucked under a blanket or leaning softly into a chair, this history begins to drift gently alongside your thoughts. It is a slow story of experimentation, of observation, and of shared human curiosity. Across continents, across millennia, people discovered that a small shift in perception could create moments of calm, reflection, and quiet pleasure without ever needing the intensity we might associate with modern substances. So as the night deepens and the world outside remains hushed, we continue our slow drift into the ancient past. Humans were patient, careful, and endlessly curious. They discovered subtle ways to ease the mind and body, to connect with each other, and to softly alter perception. And in that, there is a gentle continuity that stretches across time and space, reminding us that the search for calm and quiet transformation is as old as humanity itself. We will continue this journey further into Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, tracing the slow evolution of these practices as they became more formalized, more documented, and slightly more complex, while retaining that same quiet, subtle purpose that has always defined the human desire to gently shift consciousness. As the night stretches on and the soft rhythm of history continues to unfold, let us drift slowly into medieval Europe, a world of stone castles, quiet villages, and surprisingly intentional approaches to altering perception. Life here was often slow, sometimes harsh, and occasionally tedious, so humans, as always, found gentle ways to make the day feel softer and the mind a little lighter. Medieval Europeans had inherited knowledge from the Greeks and Romans, filtered through centuries of oral tradition and monastic preservation. Monks copied manuscripts, scribes recorded medicinal uses of plants, and herbalists quietly experimented with what the world had offered. Some of these plants were used to ease pain, others to calm the mind, and some were noted for their ability to produce mild alterations in perception. But for the most part, medieval Europeans were careful. Substances were integrated into daily life, not pursued for reckless excitement. One of the most common mild relaxants was beer. Brewing beer had spread throughout Europe centuries earlier, and by the medieval period, it had become a daily staple in many regions. The beer was often weak by modern standards, intended to hydrate, calm, and accompany food rather than overwhelm the drinker. Communities developed subtle rituals around its consumption, a slow evening with family or neighbors, conversations stretching gently into the night, minds relaxing after the day's labor. In monasteries, monks carefully measured their consumption, aware that even mild excess could lead to minor disorder. In addition to fermented beverages, a wide range of herbs were in regular use. Valerian root was known to calm the nerves, while hops, which later became a standard ingredient in beer, had mild sedative properties. Sage, mint, and other common herbs were used both for culinary and medicinal purposes, often overlapping in their calming effects. The line between food, medicine, and mild psychoactive use was thin, almost imperceptible, which allowed people to subtly adjust their moods without dramatic intervention. And then there were the more unusual plants, sometimes noted in herbals and monastic writings, which had gentle but noticeable effects. Henbane, for example, was often included in ointments and preparations intended to soothe pain or help with sleep. It was used cautiously because its effects could be unpredictable, but when prepared with care, it produced a soft sense of detachment and relaxation. Humans had learned by trial and observation that subtlety was key. Too much of anything could be dangerous, so moderation was both a practical and cultural principle. We can picture, slowly, a quiet village in northern Europe. Smoke rising from chimneys, the smell of cooking bread in the air, the faint tang of fermented beer, and perhaps the gentle scent of dried herbs hanging in bundles from rafters. People sit together after long hours in the fields or workshops, sipping drinks, tasting teas, and sometimes chewing small amounts of herbs known to calm the mind. There is a rhythm here, the slow transition from labor to rest, aided by mild, carefully managed adjustments in perception. In the courts of medieval Europe, subtle experimentation took on a slightly more structured and ceremonial form. Nobles and royals had access to a wide variety of substances and often incorporated them into carefully controlled feasts or social gatherings. Wine was abundant, sometimes infused with herbs for taste and effect. Fruits and honey could be fermented into sweet, gentle beverages. The goal was not reckless intoxication, but enhancement of social ritual, a way to glide through conversation and ceremony without the edges of tension or fatigue. And yet, even in these structured settings, humans remained humans.
They were always individuals who indulged a bit more than was wise, who experimented with combinations, and who occasionally found themselves slightly disoriented or embarrassed the next day. But the overall pattern was one of slow, measured exploration, rather than chaos. Meanwhile, across Europe, the late medieval period saw increased documentation of herbs and substances in early pharmacopoeias. These texts, often written by monks or early physicians, describe plants with detailed notes about their effects on the body and mind. Some were intended to induce sleep or calm nerves, others to ease minor pains or digestive discomfort. A few produced subtle shifts in perception when used in larger quantities, and some were explicitly tied to religious or ritual use. The recurring theme is balance, observation, careful application, and a gentle respect for the effects of nature. As we drift forward into early modern Europe, beginning roughly in the 15th and 16th centuries, experimentation becomes a little more formalized. Knowledge from the ancient world is rediscovered and translated. Herbalists and apothecaries document effects systematically. Distillation techniques allow for stronger alcohol, though most daily consumption remains moderate. People begin to experiment with combinations of herbs and alcohol, sometimes creating stronger tinctures for medicinal purposes. Again, intention matters. The goal is mild alteration, easing, or comfort, rather than dramatic intoxication. The social and cultural context of these substances continues to shape their use. In small villages, in monasteries, in courts, people are aware of what works, what is acceptable, and what should be approached with caution. Even as stronger alcohol becomes more common, the underlying principle remains: subtle adjustment, careful observation, and integration into daily life. Humans, it seems, are consistent across time. One particularly interesting thread emerges when we consider the role of ritual and ceremony. Across Europe, herbal use, mild intoxication, and ceremonial feasting often overlap. Certain herbs or infusions are reserved for specific festivals or rites, just as fermented beverages accompany communal gatherings. In each case, the use of substances is carefully calibrated. It is part of the rhythm of life, rather than a break from it. Humans enjoy novelty and subtle shifts, but they rarely seek chaos in these early contexts.
Even the more unusual or slightly dangerous plants are treated with respect. Belladonna, for example, appears in some early herbal texts. It produces mild psychoactive effects when used in small quantities, but its risks are clearly documented. People do not use it casually. They understand the fine line between a gentle shift in perception and unintended consequences. Observation, care, and repetition become a subtle art, passed down through generations. Meanwhile, fermented beverages continue to be a quiet constant in daily life. Beer, wine, and mead serve multiple functions: hydration, mild stimulation, social cohesion, and gentle mood adjustment. They are rarely overwhelming. In many ways, they serve as a backdrop to daily life, creating a calm, slightly altered atmosphere rather than a dramatic departure from reality. We can picture, slowly, the quiet scenes of early modern Europe: the soft glow of candles in a dimly lit room, the smell of herbs in the air, the gentle murmur of conversation around a shared drink. People chew, sip, taste, observe, and remember. Across the centuries, these small, deliberate adjustments in perception create continuity, a shared understanding of how subtle intervention can ease life's burdens. It is also worth noting the way knowledge spreads. Monks, herbalists, travelers, and traders all contribute to the slow accumulation of understanding. A plant used in one region may become known in another, recipes adapted, effects observed, and rituals refined. Humans across Europe, and indeed across the world, are quietly experimenting and sharing observations, building a tapestry of knowledge that connects centuries and continents. And so, as the night deepens further and your own mind begins to settle, we can see a pattern emerging. Across centuries, from ancient civilizations to medieval villages and early modern courts, humans consistently sought subtle shifts in perception. They were patient, careful, socially aware, and deeply observant. They experimented not for reckless thrill, but for gentle adjustment, comfort, insight, and the softening of the day's edges. These small, quiet practices create a through line in human history. The desire to alter consciousness is ancient, universal, and surprisingly gentle in its earliest forms. From early fermented drinks to carefully prepared herbal infusions, humans learned to navigate the delicate balance between effect and moderation, between curiosity and caution. And in that slow, deliberate approach, we see a quiet elegance, a reflection of the human mind's curiosity tempered by practical wisdom. So, as the evening deepens further and your own mind begins to settle, it is clear that ancient and medieval humans were patient, careful, and endlessly inventive. They discovered that with small, deliberate adjustments, life could be eased, the mind softened, and perception gently expanded. The story is slow, calm, and continuous, much like the night itself. And it is a story that will carry us further as we explore even more subtle escapes, rituals, and gentle experiments in the centuries to come.
As the night deepens further and your surroundings grow quieter, let us drift once again across oceans, this time returning to the early Americas. Here, the story of subtle human experimentation with plants and gentle shifts in perception continues, unfolding in a landscape of forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts. Life was slow, labor was demanding, and the mind naturally sought ways to soften the edges of daily experience. Humans, as always, turned to the resources around them, learning patiently which plants eased the body, calmed the mind, or altered perception just enough to make the day feel different. In Mesoamerica, we have already touched on cacao and peyote, but there were additional plants and rituals that quietly shaped human experience. The use of tobacco, for example, was ancient, and early peoples often treated it not as a recreational substance in the modern sense, but as a spiritual or communal tool. Nicotine, when inhaled or chewed in small quantities, provided a subtle stimulation, a shift in attention and mood that could accompany ceremonies, trade gatherings, or moments of reflection. It was not a tool of excess, but a gentle aid in navigating social and spiritual landscapes. In the Andes, coca leaves continued to be used thoughtfully. Workers at high altitudes chewed the leaves during long treks, gaining mild stimulation and relief from fatigue, allowing them to endure physically demanding tasks. In ceremonial contexts, the same leaves could facilitate focus or provide a quiet sense of connectedness. The human approach here was consistent: observation, trial, repetition, and integration into daily life. These practices were not reckless but methodical, and they were shared socially, ensuring continuity and safety. Across North America, indigenous peoples engaged in subtle experimentation with plants as well. The use of various hallucinogenic or calming plants, often incorporated into slow, structured ceremonies, provided mild shifts in perception, encouraging reflection, storytelling, and spiritual connection. Again, these practices were careful and communal. There was guidance, there were rules, and there was respect for the plant's effects. Humans consistently discovered that subtlety allowed for insight without chaos, calm without danger. In addition to psychoactive plants, fermented beverages were present in many indigenous cultures. Small amounts of fermented corn, fruits, or honey provided gentle stimulation, hydration, and a slow transition into communal relaxation.
The use of alcohol was generally integrated into ritual and social structure rather than pursued for individual excess. Social norms, observation, and tradition created a stable framework that allowed mild alterations of perception without disrupting life's broader rhythm. Now, if we drift gently northward, we notice that even in colder climates with limited flora, humans found creative ways to achieve subtle shifts in mood and perception. Small doses of stimulative plants, herbal infusions, and fermented beverages, combined with the natural rhythm of daily labor and rest, created a consistent pattern. Humans everywhere were quietly experimenting, observing, and sharing the results across generations. Meanwhile, in Africa, these practices continued to develop in parallel. Across the continent, people discovered local plants with mild psychoactive effects, used them carefully, and integrated them into daily life, rituals, and healing practices. Fermented beverages, often made from grains or fruits, were central to social cohesion and relaxation. Communities would gather in the evening, share drinks and conversation, and perhaps chew or sip herbs that produced subtle shifts in sensation. The approach was always measured. Excess was rare, and the goal was balance, comfort, and gentle alteration of awareness. What is striking about these early practices across continents is the universality of human curiosity. From North and South America to Africa and Asia, humans discovered that minor shifts in perception could create calm, connection, and insight. They experimented slowly, recorded their observations, shared knowledge socially, and integrated these discoveries into daily life. The use of substances was almost always deliberate, structured, and carefully observed, even when incorporated into what we might now consider recreational settings. Let us float back for a moment to early Europe, where these patterns continued to evolve. By the late medieval and early modern periods, humans had accumulated centuries of observations. Alcohol was ubiquitous in many regions, and herbalism was increasingly formalized. People documented effects of plants like valerian, henbane, and belladonna with care, noting their safe ranges and subtle impacts. Social rituals, banquets, festivals, quiet gatherings often incorporated mild substances for gentle enhancement of perception. The rhythm of daily life dictated the manner and timing of consumption. Humans had learned that subtlety and intention were key to achieving beneficial effects without disruption. The courts of Europe also offer insight into early experimentation with mild mind-altering substances. Nobles had access to imported herbs, spices, and beverages, and they used them with a sense of ritualized moderation. Tea, coffee, and chocolate were later introductions, each carrying mild stimulative or relaxing effects. Their consumption was integrated into slow, deliberate social patterns, discussion, reading, or leisure rather than frenzy. Even in these settings, humans sought gentle alterations of perception rather than dramatic escape.
It is worth noting that across these diverse contexts, humans consistently displayed remarkable patience. Observations were recorded slowly, sometimes orally, sometimes in manuscripts. Recipes, rituals, and guidelines for use were developed over generations. The careful attention to dosage, timing, and social context reflects a deliberate, methodical approach to exploring perception. These were not impulsive experiments, but carefully orchestrated practices that respected the subtle power of plants and fermented beverages. Meanwhile, across all continents, there is evidence of integration with spiritual and ritual life. Substances were rarely used in isolation. They were embedded in ceremonies, festivals, healing practices, and social gatherings. Humans recognized that the effect of a plant or beverage was enhanced or moderated by the context in which it was consumed. This understanding was passed from elders to younger generations, reinforcing both safety and cultural continuity. Consider, gently, a quiet evening in a European village. Smoke curling from chimneys, the soft glow of lanterns, the faint aroma of herbs, and the gentle murmur of conversation. People sip mild beer,
taste teas, and chew or crush small leaves with carefully observed effects. Across the room, a monk might be preparing an herbal remedy for an older neighbor. A noble might sip a spiced beverage, and children play quietly under the watchful eyes of adults. Across time and space, humans consistently discover the same principle. Gentle adjustments in perception are integrated into the rhythms of life, carefully observed and shared socially. As we drift further, it is clear that these patterns are universal. From the Americas to Africa to Europe and Asia, humans sought subtle shifts in perception. Fermented beverages, herbal infusions, and psychoactive plants were used thoughtfully. Rituals, ceremonies, and social norms guided use. Observation and tradition preserved knowledge. The purpose was calm, reflection, and gentle enhancement of daily experience, not dramatic escape. Even as humans experimented more formally with apothecaries and herbal manuals in early modern Europe, the principle remained the same. Care, observation, and social guidance ensured that mild alterations of perception enhanced life rather than disrupted it. Humans learned that the mind and body respond best to subtlety, structure, and respect. Across continents and centuries, these principles shaped the human experience of mild psychoactive substances. So, as the night continues and your own thoughts begin to soften, we can see that the story of early human experimentation with perception is slow, continuous, and universal. Humans everywhere discovered that gentle shifts in perception, carefully observed and socially integrated, could ease life's burdens, deepen reflection, and soften the edges of daily existence. And as we continue drifting together through this calm and quiet history, we are reminded that the search for subtle mental alteration is as ancient as humanity itself. Across oceans, forests, deserts, and mountains, humans discovered, experimented, and shared knowledge in ways that were patient, methodical, and deeply human. These are not tales of chaos or reckless indulgence, but of observation, subtlety, and continuity. A story that drifts gently alongside the quiet night, much like we do now. We will continue this journey, moving further into the Renaissance, the spread of trade networks, and the increasing documentation of plants and substances, tracing the slow evolution of human curiosity and gentle experimentation across the centuries.
As the night deepens and the quiet hum of history flows onward, let us drift into Renaissance Europe, a time of curiosity, rediscovery, and gentle experimentation. The centuries following the medieval period brought remarkable shifts in human knowledge, travel, and communication. People were slowly expanding the horizons of what they knew about the world, and with this expansion came an increasing awareness of plants, herbs, and beverages that could subtly shift perception. Life remained slow in many ways, labor demanding, and routines structured, so humans continued their careful, deliberate pursuit of mild mental adjustment. In Italy, France, and Spain, the rediscovery of classical texts from Greece and Rome sparked curiosity about the natural world. Apothecaries and scholars eagerly translated manuscripts that described herbs, fermented beverages, and mild psychoactive plants. They observed effects carefully, recording not just physical impacts, but also subtle shifts in mood, attention, and thought. Knowledge was codified more formally, yet the principle remained consistent. Subtlety, observation, and intention guided use. Coffee, arriving from the Middle East in the 16th century, brought a new kind of gentle stimulation. Europeans quickly noticed that sipping coffee produced alertness without the violent effects of strong alcohol. Coffee houses emerged slowly, offering calm, social spaces where conversation could meander and minds could drift gently between observation, debate, and reflection. The beverage's mild stimulant effects were integrated seamlessly into social life, providing subtle mental adjustment rather than chaos. Chocolate, derived from cacao in Mesoamerica, followed a similar pattern.
Early European preparations were bitter, sometimes mixed with spices and sweetened with sugar, creating a beverage that was slowly savored. Its effects were mild but noticeable, providing gentle mood enhancement and a sense of comfort. In aristocratic settings, chocolate was often associated with leisure and ceremony, reinforcing the pattern observed across centuries. Substances were used to integrate subtly into life's rhythm, rather than disrupt it. Meanwhile, wine remained a constant, evolving with improvements in production and trade. Nobles and scholars experimented with fortified wines, infused with herbs and spices, observing nuanced effects on mood and perception. These adjustments were still measured, social, and often tied to discussion, ceremony, or quiet reflection. Even in moments of indulgence, moderation was culturally reinforced, and the emphasis remained on gentle alteration rather than escape. Herbalism continued to flourish during the Renaissance. Valerian, hops, rosemary, and other plants were carefully documented in herbals, which described preparation methods, dosages, and subtle effects. Physicians and apothecaries were increasingly systematic, creating tinctures, teas, and ointments that allowed the body and mind to shift softly without overwhelming the senses. Observation remained the guiding principle. Record carefully, try cautiously, and refine over generations. We can imagine a quiet evening in Florence or Paris, the soft glow of candles reflecting off polished wood and stone, the faint aroma of herbs in the air, the gentle murmur of conversation around a shared beverage. Scholars sip coffee while examining manuscripts, a noblewoman tastes a spiced chocolate preparation, and a craftsman enjoys a mild beer after a day's labor. Across centuries, humans continued to explore, observe, and integrate subtle mental shifts into daily life. Trade routes expanded during the Renaissance, bringing new substances from distant lands. Spices, rare herbs, and imported beverages enriched European knowledge, creating opportunities for subtle experimentation. Humans adapted these new resources thoughtfully, often integrating them into existing rituals, social gatherings, and medicinal practices. Knowledge spread slowly but steadily, allowing observations to accumulate across generations and regions. The balance between curiosity and caution persisted. Even as new substances arrived, humans recognized the potential for overindulgence. Records of adverse effects appear in manuals, letters, and diaries, reminding readers to observe carefully and respect the power of these plants and beverages. Experimentation remained deliberate, measured, and socially guided. Across centuries, humans had learned that the most effective way to gently alter perception was through patience, observation, and integration into life's rhythm. In parallel, spiritual and ritual contexts continued to shape the use of substances. Monastic orders, indigenous practices adapted in colonial contexts, and ceremonial gatherings all incorporated mild alterations of perception to enhance reflection, ritual, or communal connection. Even with increasing documentation and formalization, the human approach remained remarkably consistent. Subtle shifts in mood and awareness were embedded in the daily and ceremonial rhythms of life. Meanwhile, alcohol continued to serve multiple roles: hydration, gentle stimulation, social cohesion, and subtle alteration of perception. Beer and wine remained central to many communities, with attention to preparation, dosage, and timing ensuring moderate effects. Across social classes, humans discovered that gentle adjustment rather than excess created calm, reflection, and shared connection. It is also notable that early scientific exploration during the Renaissance began to provide more systematic understanding of human physiology and plant chemistry. Physicians and naturalists observed effects carefully, recording not only outcomes, but subtle nuances of perception, mood, and cognitive shifts. Though limited by the era's knowledge, these observations contributed to a growing body of structured empirical insight. Humans continued to explore cautiously, but with increasingly sophisticated tools for observation and documentation. Across Europe, the emergence of salons, intellectual gatherings, and coffee houses created spaces for deliberate, gentle mental adjustment. Conversation, debate, and reflection flowed slowly, supported by mild stimulants like coffee, chocolate, and lightly spiced wines. Social and intellectual life became intertwined with careful experimentation, reinforcing the pattern established across millennia. Subtle shifts in perception enhance experience when integrated thoughtfully into communal and ritual contexts. Meanwhile, travel and colonial expansion began to introduce Europeans to new substances from the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Tobacco, cacao, and various herbs arrived in small quantities at first, carefully observed and gradually integrated. Europeans adapted rituals to accommodate these new resources, reinforcing existing patterns of slow, deliberate exploration. Observation, caution, and social guidance continued to define practice. Even as access to these substances expanded, moderation remained culturally reinforced. Letters, diaries, and manuals often warned of excess, noting that subtle adjustment was far more valuable than overindulgence. Humans had learned over millennia that the most reliable path to calm, reflection, and social cohesion was careful observation and gentle application. Imagine, gently, a quiet evening in Amsterdam or Venice. The soft glow of lanterns along canals, the aroma of freshly roasted coffee, chocolate, and herbs in the air. Scholars and merchants conversing slowly over shared beverages. Each sip, each taste, each carefully observed effect reinforces centuries of accumulated knowledge. Across continents, humans have consistently discovered that subtle shifts in perception, rather than dramatic escape, are the most enduring and reliable. By the late Renaissance, Europe had developed extensive networks of apothecaries, herbalists, and intellectuals who carefully documented subtle psychoactive effects. Manuals provided guidance on preparation, dosage, and social context. Observation remained the guiding principle. Even when substances had stronger effects, the emphasis was on integration, social guidance, and careful monitoring. Humans consistently preferred gradual, gentle alteration to chaotic or intense experiences. And so, as the night deepens and your own thoughts drift gently, we can see that Renaissance Europe represents a slow codification of principles observed across millennia and continents. Humans systematically recorded subtle effects, integrated new substances into social and ritual life, and maintained a remarkable balance between curiosity and caution. Across time, the desire to gently shift perception remained universal, patient, and methodical. These centuries demonstrate a continuity in human experience. Subtle mental alteration is pursued not for thrill or escape, but for calm, reflection, insight, and connection. Across continents and eras, humans have discovered, experimented, and shared knowledge in ways that are slow, careful, and deeply human. As you settle further into the quiet of your space, it becomes clear that this gentle exploration of perception is not just a historical curiosity, but a reflection of humanity itself, curious, patient, and attentive to the rhythms of life. We will continue this journey, drifting into the early modern period, exploring the globalization of substances, the slow evolution of social norms, and the careful, gentle experimentation that continues to define human interaction with mild psychoactive plants and beverages across the world.
As the night stretches further and the quiet settles into a soft, even hum, we drift now into the early modern era, a time when human curiosity about perception, plants, and beverages began to traverse continents more deliberately. Trade networks grew, travel expanded, and ideas moved slowly but steadily across oceans and deserts. With these changes came new encounters with plants, herbs, and substances, all of which humans gently explored, observed, and integrated into daily life. Europeans traveling to the Americas, Africa, and Asia encountered plants that were new, strange, and subtly powerful. Tobacco, cacao, and coca became part of careful experimentation, often observed in structured social contexts or ceremonial frameworks. The desire for slight shifts in perception remained constant, but the means were expanding geographically and culturally. People were patient. They noted effects, shared insights, and gradually incorporated these substances into domestic, ritual, and medicinal life. Tobacco, first encountered in the Americas, is a fascinating example. Early European explorers and settlers observed indigenous peoples chewing or smoking the leaves. The effects were mild stimulation and altered attention, not the overwhelming highs associated with later mass consumption. Europeans incorporated tobacco slowly, experimenting with chewing, snuffing, and eventually smoking. Its integration was gradual and social, often tied to conversation, reflection, and ritual. Even when powerful enough to slightly intoxicate, use was deliberate, measured, and observed. Cacao, too, spread across the globe. In Mesoamerica, it had been bitter, ceremonial, and spiced. In Europe, it was gradually adapted to local tastes, sweetened with sugar, and served in domestic and social contexts. Its effect was subtle, gentle mood enhancement, slight stimulation, and comfort. Europeans appreciated these effects, integrating cacao into quiet reflection, social conversation, and meditative moments. Ritual, patience, and moderation continued to define practice. Across Asia, Europeans encountered tea and coffee, both of which offered mild, sustained stimulation. Tea ceremonies in China and Japan emphasized slow observation, mindful preparation, and subtle effect. Coffee houses in the Middle East and later Europe created spaces for calm discussion and gentle social stimulation. Across cultures, humans consistently discovered that the most effective shifts in perception were those that allowed the mind to glide slowly, subtly, and safely into altered states without chaos. Meanwhile, fermented beverages continued to dominate in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Beer, wine, mead, and fermented fruit or grain drinks were ubiquitous, serving multiple purposes: hydration, mild stimulation, social cohesion, and gentle alteration of perception. Across continents, humans observed, documented, and ritualized these effects, maintaining a remarkable balance between curiosity and caution. Daily life, social structure, and gentle experimentation intertwined seamlessly. Herbalism also expanded during this period. As trade brought new plants from distant lands, apothecaries, herbalists, and scholars tested and documented their effects. Valerian, hops, rosemary, henbane, and belladonna were joined by newly introduced herbs and spices. Preparation methods became more sophisticated, allowing more precise control over dosage and effect. Even with stronger tinctures or infusions, the principle of careful observation guided practice. Humans remained deliberate, ensuring that subtle shifts in perception enhanced life rather than disrupted it. In Africa, the exchange of plants and knowledge with European traders introduced new opportunities for gentle experimentation. Indigenous practices persisted, often blending with imported substances in socially structured and ritualized contexts. Communities maintained careful observation and social guidance, ensuring that experimentation remained subtle and safe. Across continents, the human pattern was consistent: curiosity balanced with caution, experimentation guided by observation, and effects integrated into daily and ritual life. It is fascinating to observe how early modern humans continued to codify knowledge, formalize practice, and integrate perception-altering substances into structured contexts. Manuals, letters, diaries, and apothecary records preserve centuries of careful observation. Humans learned to calibrate dosage, timing, and social setting, ensuring that effects remained gentle and useful. Across time and space, subtle alteration of perception was consistently pursued in deliberate, controlled ways. Even as new substances arrived and social contexts evolved, humans maintained a remarkable patience. Observation was continuous, and knowledge was cumulative. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, people experimented, observed, recorded, and shared insights.
Ritual, social cohesion, and daily rhythm remained central, shaping the experience of substances and their subtle effects. The integration of ritual and social context is especially notable. In both indigenous and European settings, substances were rarely used in isolation. Consumption was embedded in ceremony, festival, healing practice, or social gathering. The context guided perception, moderated effect, and reinforced cultural continuity. Humans consistently recognized that subtle shifts in consciousness were most effective when socially and ritually framed. Consider, gently, a quiet evening in an early modern port city like Lisbon or Amsterdam. Ships returning from distant lands carry new plants, herbs, and spices. In apothecaries and private homes, people experiment cautiously, observing subtle effects. Tea is prepared slowly, cacao sweetened and spiced, beer fermented carefully. Conversations flow in hushed tones, reflection drifts in measured rhythm, and curiosity is satisfied without urgency. Humans, as always, balance exploration with caution, pleasure with structure, and subtlety with observation. Meanwhile, letters and diaries reveal the human tendency to record nuance. Observers note slight changes in mood, energy, perception, and attention. Sometimes unexpected effects arise, and these are carefully documented as lessons for others. Across continents, centuries, and social contexts, humans learned that knowledge accumulates gradually, observation matters, and subtlety is often the most reliable guide.
Even as stronger stimulants and intoxicants became available, the principle of gentle experimentation persisted. Europeans consumed stronger wines, imported teas, cacao with sugar and spices, and early coffee in measured ways. Indigenous Americans, Africans, and Asians continued careful practices with their own local plants, adapting to new substances as they became available. Across all contexts, subtle shifts were preferred over extremes, and careful observation remained central to practice. The early modern period also highlights the growing sophistication of social and intellectual frameworks. Salons, coffee houses, apothecaries, and botanical gardens all became spaces where subtle experimentation, observation, and discussion coexisted. People compared effects, refined preparation methods, and shared knowledge across networks. These environments supported deliberate, measured exploration of perception, consistent with centuries of earlier human practice. In addition, religious and ceremonial contexts continued to shape human interaction with substances. In Europe, ritual use of wine in church ceremonies intertwined with domestic consumption in daily life. Across the Americas and Africa, indigenous practices adapted subtly to new contexts, preserving observation, guidance, and social structure. Across continents, humans consistently sought gentle adjustment rather than dramatic escape, reinforcing the continuity of centuries-long patterns. As we drift slowly further, it is clear that early modern humans everywhere were patient, careful, and observant. They sought gentle shifts in perception, integrated substances into daily and ceremonial life, and preserved knowledge across generations. The desire for subtle adjustment is ancient, universal, and remarkably consistent. Humans learned that small changes in perception could ease labor, support reflection, enhance social cohesion, and provide moments of calm. Imagine softly a quiet evening in an early modern European town. Candlelight flickers along cobblestone streets, merchants close their shops, apothecaries record careful observations, and neighbors gather with mild beverages and herbal teas. Across oceans, similar scenes unfold in indigenous communities, where fermented drinks, herbs, and ritual maintain gentle balance. Knowledge spreads slowly, observation guides use, and human curiosity remains patient and deliberate.
By the late early modern period, the globalization of psychoactive substances and knowledge illustrates both continuity and subtle evolution. Humans retained the same principles of observation, caution, and social guidance while encountering new plants, spices, and stimulants. Across continents, perception-altering practices became more diverse but remained deliberate, measured, and socially structured. So as the night deepens and your thoughts drift gently alongside this story, we can see that the early modern period represents a remarkable continuity in human behavior. Across oceans, cultures, and centuries, humans have been patient, observant, and careful in their exploration of perception. Subtle shifts, slow experimentation, and social integration have always been preferred over extremes or recklessness. Across time and space, the story of gentle human curiosity unfolds, a slow, deliberate current that mirrors the quiet rhythm of the night itself. We will continue this journey, moving into the modern era, tracing the globalization of psychoactive substances, the gradual increase in availability, and the continuing human preference for careful, subtle, and socially integrated experimentation that has persisted across millennia.
As the night continues its soft, unbroken flow, let us drift gently into the period of early industrialization and global colonization. The world is changing slowly but unmistakably. Roads, ships, and later trains allow people and ideas to travel farther than ever before. New continents, climates, and plants are encountered. Human curiosity, patient and deliberate as always, finds itself with an unprecedented range of substances to observe, integrate, and experiment with, all while daily life remains demanding and the mind seeks gentle relief. In the European colonial world, traders and explorers continue to transport plants and beverages from distant lands. Tea from China, cacao from the Americas, coffee from the Middle East, and spices from Asia all arrive in increasing quantities. Humans observe carefully, tasting, chewing, infusing, and fermenting, always noting subtle effects. The social and ritual context is preserved. Tea ceremonies, coffee houses, salons, and domestic gatherings become spaces for mild mental alteration, reflection, and quiet conversation. Colonization also introduces Europeans to substances that they had never encountered before. Tobacco, already observed in the Americas, becomes widely adopted across continents, consumed in pipes, snuff, or chewing forms. Its effects are mild, socially moderated, and integrated into both private and public life. Even as consumption increases, humans continue to value observation and moderation. Tobacco is part of ritual, reflection, and social interaction rather than chaotic indulgence. Cacao, increasingly sweetened with sugar, becomes a luxury in Europe. Its mild psychoactive properties, combined with sugar and spices, create gentle stimulation and comfort. Aristocrats and intellectuals alike savor it slowly, noting effects on mood and focus. The preparation and consumption of cacao, like tea and coffee, becomes an art of subtle adjustment, observation, and social cohesion. Across centuries, the principle remains consistent. Small, deliberate shifts in perception are preferred to extremes. Meanwhile, alcohol continues to dominate everyday life. Beer, wine, and distilled spirits are widespread, serving hydration, social, and mild psychoactive functions. Industrialization allows larger production, yet humans continue to moderate consumption, integrate substances into meals, and maintain social norms that prevent excess. Across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, daily life is structured around work, reflection, and measured indulgence, and alcohol remains a tool for subtle adjustment rather than escape. Herbalism, too, evolves in this era. Botanical gardens, scientific observation, and apothecary manuals contribute to increasingly precise understanding of dosage, preparation, and effect.
Valerian, hops, belladonna, and henbane continue to be documented, while new plants from colonial territories expand the repertoire. Humans learn to observe minute effects, combine substances cautiously, and integrate them into domestic, medicinal, or ceremonial practice. Even when stronger tinctures are available, observation and moderation guide use. In indigenous societies, knowledge of local plants continues alongside careful observation of introduced substances. Across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, people experiment with local herbs, fermented beverages, and psychoactive plants, gradually integrating new options introduced through trade or colonization. Observation remains central, ensuring that effects are subtle, socially guided, and safe. Communities maintain ritualized and structured approaches, reinforcing centuries-old principles of patient experimentation. The rise of coffee houses in Europe illustrates the human preference for subtle stimulation in communal contexts. Patrons sip coffee, discuss ideas, and absorb news from distant lands. Minds are gently alert, and social cohesion is reinforced. Similarly, salons, drawing rooms, and domestic gatherings continue to serve as spaces for mild mental adjustment, reflection, and social bonding. Across continents, the pattern is consistent: gentle stimulation within structured contexts. Even alcohol adapts to new social and industrial circumstances. Distilled spirits, brandies, and fortified wines are produced with greater consistency, yet social norms moderate consumption. Observers document effects, noting how small amounts enhance conversation, focus, or relaxation, while excess produces discomfort. Humans consistently favor subtle, measured shifts over extremes. Colonial trade also increases access to coca, nutmeg, pepper, and other plants with mild stimulative or psychoactive properties. Observers in Europe and the Americas experiment with preparation, dosage, and social context. Manuals describe effects carefully, emphasizing observation, patience, and integration into daily or ceremonial life. Across centuries, the principle remains consistent. Subtle perception alteration is most effective when socially and ritually framed and carefully observed. Meanwhile, urbanization brings new contexts for experimentation. Cities offer opportunities for quiet reflection in domestic spaces, structured experimentation in apothecaries, and communal observation in coffee houses, salons, and taverns. Humans continue to balance curiosity with caution, discovering that subtle adjustment enhances daily life without causing chaos. Observation, moderation, and social guidance remain central.
Across continents, humans continue to experiment with small doses of psychoactive plants for reflection, relaxation, or social bonding. Tobacco, coffee, cacao, mild alcohol, and herbal preparations are integrated carefully into social rituals, domestic routines, and ceremonial contexts. Knowledge accumulates gradually, refined through observation, letters, manuals, and oral transmission. It is also notable that scientific observation begins to emerge more formally in this era. Botanists, chemists, and physicians increasingly record plant properties, dosage, and effects with detail and precision. Even with stronger substances available, humans retain their patience and deliberation. The principle of gentle experimentation continues to guide practice, emphasizing observation, context, and cumulative knowledge. In parallel, indigenous knowledge continues to inform colonial and European understanding. Traders, explorers, and scholars learn from native practices, often integrating careful, ritualized approaches into European experimentation. Across cultures, the same principles persist: observation, social guidance, moderation, and structured exploration of perception. Imagine softly a quiet evening in an industrializing European port city. Lamps flicker along narrow streets. The smell of roasted coffee, cacao, and herbs drifts through open windows. Apothecaries record subtle observations, and citizens gather in taverns, salons, or domestic parlors.
Conversations are slow, minds alert but calm, and mild stimulation integrates seamlessly into daily and social rhythms. Across continents, similar patterns unfold, demonstrating remarkable continuity in human approach. Even as industrialization increases the production and availability of psychoactive substances, humans continue to value subtlety. Observation of dosage, context, and social interaction guides use. Fermented beverages, coffee, tea, cacao, and herbal preparations are consumed deliberately. Social rituals, domestic practice, and ceremonial contexts remain central. Across centuries, humans maintain a balance between curiosity and caution, exploration and moderation. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the global network of trade, observation, and experimentation has expanded considerably. Humans across continents continue patient experimentation, carefully documenting effects, integrating new substances, and preserving centuries-old principles of subtle adjustment. Observation, social guidance, and structured practice remain central. Across oceans and centuries, the preference for gentle alteration of perception endures, demonstrating the remarkable continuity of human behavior. In quiet homes, taverns, coffee houses, and salons, humans sip, chew, taste, and observe. Across continents, subtle experimentation continues to enhance daily life, reflection, and social connection. Knowledge accumulates gradually, passed through manuscripts, letters, oral instruction, and observation. Subtlety, patience, and integration into life's rhythms remain the guiding principles. Even as the industrial and early colonial period illustrate that even with increasing access and global distribution, humans continue to prefer subtlety, observation, and social integration. Across continents and centuries, gentle experimentation persists as a consistent principle, reflecting patience, curiosity, and a deep human understanding of the balance between perception, ritual, and daily life.
As the night drifts on and the world outside your window grows stiller, let us move into the 19th century, an era often remembered for its industrial growth, social strictures, and quiet obsession with order. The Victorian period, in particular, provides a fascinating lens through which to observe humanity's patient, deliberate relationship with substances that gently shift perception. Across Europe and increasingly across the globe, humans continued their subtle experimentation, now codified through manuals, medical treatises, domestic etiquette guides, and social norms that emphasized control, observation, and moderation. In Victorian England, tea had fully cemented its position as the central mild stimulant of daily life. Afternoon tea, once a social novelty, became a deeply ingrained cultural ritual. Individuals would prepare and sip carefully brewed leaves, often in tranquil domestic settings, noting the mild stimulation, the gentle lift in alertness, and the comfort of warmth. Tea houses and private parlors became spaces for quiet conversation, leisurely reading, and reflection, embodying centuries of careful observation and integration of subtle effects into daily rhythm. Coffee, too, remained a steady presence. In cities like London and Edinburgh, coffee houses continued their tradition as spaces for intellectual exchange, debate, and leisurely observation. Patrons would sip slowly, noticing subtle mental stimulation, slight elevation of mood, and gentle sharpening of focus. Even as caffeine consumption increased in popularity, social norms reinforced moderation. Humans, as always, discovered that subtle shifts in perception were most reliable and beneficial when carefully measured, socially guided, and ritualized. Chocolate and cacao beverages, increasingly sweetened and spiced, remained a delicacy among the middle and upper classes. Its effects were mild but perceptible, a gentle lift in mood, a warming comfort, a quiet sense of calm. Chocolatiers experimented with combinations of spices, sugar, and preparation techniques, observing nuanced effects and documenting preferences. Across Victorian homes and salons, cacao became another tool for deliberate, gentle enhancement of perception. Alcohol, particularly beer, wine, and spirits, maintained a central role in both social and domestic life. Temperance movements, which gained momentum during the 19th century, paradoxically reflect the long-standing human awareness of moderation's importance. People observed effects carefully, socially guided consumption, and integrated alcoholic beverages into daily routines, communal meals, and celebratory occasions. Even as production and availability increased, humans consistently favored subtle, controlled effects over extremes. Herbalism and botanical exploration continued to flourish. Victorian interest in botany, natural history, and medical science created a framework for increasingly systematic observation. Plants such as valerian, chamomile, hops, belladonna, and henbane were prepared in teas, tinctures, and infusions with care. Manuals meticulously described dosage, timing, preparation, and subtle effects on mood and perception. Across households and apothecaries, the principle of deliberate, patient experimentation persisted. Humans sought gentle alterations rather than dramatic escape, maintaining centuries-old patterns. Colonial expansion continued to introduce Europeans to new plants and beverages. Tea, coffee, cacao, tobacco, and various herbs from Asia, Africa, and the Americas arrived with increasing frequency. Observers integrated these substances carefully, noting dosage, preparation, and social context. Indigenous knowledge often informed European practice. Across continents, humans preserved continuity, patient observation, structured experimentation, social guidance, and integration into daily and ceremonial life. In urban Victorian life, quiet domestic rituals dominated. Afternoon tea, evening chocolate, mild herbal infusions, and measured alcoholic beverages punctuated the day. These subtle stimulants supported reflection, conversation, social cohesion, and minor shifts in perception. Social etiquette and domestic order reinforced moderation, guiding use in ways consistent with centuries of accumulated human practice. The rise of pharmacies, chemists, and apothecaries further systematized knowledge. Manuals and handbooks documented both traditional and newly introduced plants. Observers carefully noted effects on perception, mood, alertness, and comfort. Even as stronger tinctures or alcohol-based infusions became available, humans retained an emphasis on subtle, patient observation. Across continents and social classes, the principle remained consistent: gentle, deliberate alteration of perception integrated into life's daily and ritual rhythms. Meanwhile, literature, letters, and diaries reflect the quiet human fascination with perception. Authors describe afternoons spent sipping tea, evenings with chocolate, mild intoxication from wine, or careful herbal remedies. Observations often emphasize social cohesion, reflective leisure, and subtle mental effects. Humans across centuries continued to prioritize careful integration over reckless indulgence. Tobacco remained widely used in pipes, cigars, and snuff. The effects were mild, socially moderated, and ritualized. Smokers noted the subtle stimulation, the relaxation of ritual, and the gentle lift in mood or attention. Across Europe, and increasingly the Americas, tobacco consumption followed centuries-old principles: deliberate use, social guidance, and careful observation. Even as mass production increased availability, humans maintained patient, structured practice. It is important to note the continuity of indigenous knowledge during this period. In colonial regions, traditional practices persisted alongside European experimentation. Communities continued careful observation, structured rituals, and integration into daily life. Across continents,
Centuries of patient human curiosity coalesced into remarkably similar patterns. Subtle shifts in perception were most effective when integrated socially, ritualistically, and methodically. Industrialization and urbanization altered the pace of life, but did not diminish these centuries-old patterns. Even as cities grew, labor intensified, and technological change accelerated, humans continued to integrate gentle stimulants and perception-altering substances into structured routines. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, herbal infusions, and moderate alcohol provided calm, reflection, and mild stimulation within socially accepted frameworks. Observation, patience, and structure remained central. By the mid to late 19th century, the cumulative global knowledge of plants and beverages allowed for increasingly nuanced experimentation. Apothecaries, household manuals, and scientific texts documented subtle mental effects. Individuals experimented with combinations, timing, and preparation methods, noting outcomes carefully. Across continents, centuries of patient observation continued to inform practice, emphasizing moderation, reflection, and social integration. Imagine softly a Victorian evening in London or Paris. Lamplight flickers along cobblestone streets. The aroma of freshly brewed tea and chocolate drifts through open windows. Gentle conversations flow in salons and drawing rooms, and apothecaries meticulously record observations. Patrons sip slowly, observe subtle effects, and reflect quietly. Across continents, indigenous practices persist in parallel, maintaining careful integration of local plants, fermented beverages, and ritual into daily life. Even as new stimulants and psychoactive substances slowly emerge, humans demonstrate continuity in approach. Observation, patience, and structured practice remain central. Mild perception-altering substances continue to support reflection, social cohesion, and gentle mental adjustment. Across centuries, cultures, and continents, the preference for subtle, socially guided experimentation persists. The Victorian era exemplifies humanity's cumulative knowledge. Long-standing principles of careful observation, social moderation, ritual integration, and patient experimentation guide daily life. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, herbal infusions, and moderate alcohol serve as tools for subtle mental adjustment. Social frameworks, domestic routines, and ceremonial practices maintain structure. Across centuries, humans refine techniques, record outcomes, and transmit knowledge, ensuring that subtle shifts in perception are both safe and meaningful. Across Europe, colonies, and industrial cities, humans continue to explore the interplay between perception, ritual, and social structure. Observation is central, experimentation cautious, and integration into daily life deliberate. Even as the pace of life accelerates, subtlety remains the guiding principle. Humans have consistently discovered that patient, socially and culturally guided shifts in perception are more effective and enduring than extremes. In quiet homes, salons, coffee houses, and apothecaries, the practice continues. Gentle sips of tea, careful inhalations of tobacco, measured consumption of alcohol, and deliberate herbal infusions reflect centuries of accumulated knowledge. Across continents, humans observe effects, refine preparation, and integrate perception-altering substances into structured, socially guided contexts. Patience, observation, and subtlety remain central. By the late 19th century, the pattern is unmistakable. Humans have mastered the patient, deliberate approach to gentle mental alteration. Across cultures, continents, and centuries, the principles are remarkably consistent. Subtlety, observation, social integration, and structured experimentation remain central. Humans have discovered that small shifts in perception, carefully observed and integrated, enhance life, reflection, and social cohesion without chaos or disruption. Across industrial cities, rural villages, and colonial settlements, these practices illustrate a continuity in human behavior that stretches back millennia. From early ceremonial plant use to carefully measured tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, herbal infusions, and moderate alcohol, humans have pursued subtle mental adjustment with patience, observation, and social guidance. Across time and space, this deliberate, methodical approach to perception remains a defining aspect of human experience.
As the night deepens further and your surroundings settle into stillness, we drift now into the early 20th century, a period marked by rapid technological progress, global conflict, and shifting social norms. Life became faster in many ways, yet humans continued their centuries-long relationship with substances that gently altered perception, integrating them into daily life, social rituals, and reflection. Despite industrial acceleration, the human preference for subtle, deliberate experimentation with perception remained remarkably consistent. Coffee houses and tea rooms continued to thrive in Europe and North America, evolving in response to urbanization and industrial schedules. Workers, intellectuals, and artists alike relied on carefully prepared beverages to maintain alertness, support reflection, or simply provide a quiet moment of pause. The effects were subtle, mild, and socially structured. A sip here, a gentle lift and focus there, a shared moment of calm conversation. Even as machines accelerated production and schedules, humans maintained centuries-old practices of patient observation and structured consumption. Chocolate, increasingly mass-produced but still often associated with comfort and mild stimulation, remained a favorite among middle-class households. The addition of sugar, milk, and spices created beverages and confections that offered gentle elevation of mood, slight stimulation, and warmth. Across Europe and the Americas, people integrated chocolate into domestic rituals, social gatherings, and quiet personal reflection. Its effects were consistent with historical patterns, subtle, deliberate, and socially guided. Tobacco use continued to expand, now in cigarettes alongside pipes and cigars. Advertising, popular culture, and mass production increased accessibility, but the principle of careful observation persisted. Smokers noted subtle shifts in alertness, relaxation, or mood, while social and cultural norms reinforced moderation. In both public spaces and private settings, tobacco consumption followed long-established patterns of structured experimentation and gentle perception adjustment. Alcohol remained central to daily life, though temperance movements and shifting regulations reflected an ongoing awareness of moderation. Beer, wine, and distilled spirits were consumed with attention to dosage, timing, and social context. Even as production methods improved and availability increased, the human approach to subtle alteration of perception remained patient and structured. Alcohol, like coffee, tea, chocolate, and tobacco, continued to be integrated into daily rhythm, social gathering, and reflection. Herbalism and apothecary practices evolved alongside scientific advances. Pharmacology began formalizing preparation, dosage, and effects, but humans retained centuries-old approaches to observation and moderation. Mild herbal infusions, tinctures, and remedies continued to be consumed carefully, noted for their effects on mood, alertness, or calm. Across continents, both indigenous and European practices emphasized careful observation, social guidance, and integration into daily and ceremonial life. Globalization accelerated during this period, expanding the availability of psychoactive plants and beverages. Trade networks introduced tea from Asia, cacao from the Americas, coffee from the Middle East, tobacco from the Americas, and various herbs from Africa and Asia. Humans observed effects carefully, integrated substances into social rituals, and codified knowledge in manuals, scientific texts, and domestic practice. The principles of subtlety, patience, and social guidance remained remarkably consistent across cultures and continents. In the context of urban life, cafes, salons, and parlors provided structured spaces for gentle mental adjustment.
Patrons sipped slowly, observed effects, and engaged in quiet conversation, reflection, or reading. These spaces exemplify the centuries-old human preference for integrating subtle mental shifts into social and domestic life. Even amid industrialization and technological acceleration, humans maintained the deliberate, measured approach that had guided experimentation for millennia. Indigenous and colonial knowledge continued to inform practice in the early 20th century. Traditional uses of psychoactive plants persisted alongside European and industrial experimentation. Communities maintained structured rituals, careful observation, and integration into daily life, preserving continuity across centuries. Across continents, subtle shifts in perception were consistently preferred over extremes, reflecting a deep, patient understanding of human physiology and social context. The early 20th century also saw the beginnings of formal scientific study into the effects of psychoactive substances. Researchers observed caffeine, theobromine, nicotine, alcohol, and various herbal compounds systematically, noting dosage, timing, and subtle effects on mood, alertness, and perception. While some substances were explored for medical or recreational use, the overarching principle remained: careful observation, integration into structured contexts, and moderation. Across centuries, humans consistently valued subtle adjustment over dramatic experience. Social rituals continued to reinforce structured consumption. Afternoon tea, evening chocolate, coffee breaks, shared tobacco, and moderate alcohol consumption provided small, predictable shifts in perception that enhanced conversation, reflection, and communal connection. Humans observed effects meticulously, recorded outcomes, and refined preparation methods. Across continents and social strata, the principle of gentle, patient experimentation persisted. Even in the midst of global conflict, economic upheaval, and urban expansion, humans relied on subtle mental adjustment for comfort, focus, and reflection. Tea and coffee offered gentle stimulation during long workdays. Chocolate provided warmth and comfort. Alcohol and tobacco facilitated social bonding. The integration of substances into daily life remained deliberate, socially guided, and measured. Observation and experience continued to accumulate gradually, reinforcing centuries of knowledge. Mass production and urbanization did alter some practices. Ready-made beverages, pre-packaged chocolate, and cigarette manufacturing increased accessibility and convenience. Yet even with these technological shifts, humans maintained long-standing preferences for patience, observation, and social moderation. Subtle shifts in perception continued to be prized over extremes, reflecting a deep continuity in human behavior and understanding. Scientific and industrial advances also enabled refinement in preparation and consistency. Coffee roasters perfected roasting techniques. Chocolatiers developed precise mixtures of cacao, sugar, and milk. Tobacco processors standardized blends. Apothecaries produced consistent tinctures. These refinements allowed humans to observe effects with greater precision, further codifying centuries of accumulated knowledge about subtle perception alteration. Across continents, similar patterns persisted. Indigenous communities maintained careful rituals, Europeans codified knowledge in manuals, and urban populations integrated mild stimulants into daily routines. Observation, patience, social guidance, and structured experimentation continued to define human interaction with psychoactive substances. The preference for subtle, gentle shifts in perception persisted unaffected by technological, industrial, or cultural acceleration.
Imagine softly an early 20th century evening in London, Paris, New York, or Shanghai. Gas and electric lamps cast a warm glow. Cafes and parlors hum quietly. Tea steams in delicate porcelain cups. Chocolate is prepared and savored. Tobacco smoke drifts in measured curls, and mild alcoholic beverages punctuate conversation. Patrons sip, observe, reflect, and integrate subtle shifts in perception into daily life. Across continents, centuries of accumulated knowledge and practice continue seamlessly. Even with new global distribution, scientific inquiry, and industrial production, the human approach to gentle mental adjustment remained patient and deliberate. Observation of dosage, timing, preparation, and social context continued to guide practice. Across centuries, humans discovered that small, socially and culturally guided shifts in perception are more effective, reliable, and enduring than extremes or recklessness. Across urban centers, rural villages, and colonial territories, humans continue centuries of accumulated practice. Careful observation, social moderation, ritual integration, and patient experimentation. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, herbal infusions, and moderate alcohol remain central tools for subtle mental adjustment. Social norms, domestic routines, and ceremonial contexts reinforce structure, guiding consumption in ways consistent with millennia of human experience. By the mid-20th century, it becomes clear that the early 20th century represents both refinement and continuity. Across continents, across cultures, and across centuries, humans maintain patient curiosity, careful observation, and structured integration of substances into life. The preference for subtle, socially guided, and deliberate shifts in perception is as consistent now as it was in ancient times, a testament to the enduring human understanding of the mind, ritual, and daily life. As you settle further into quiet thought, it becomes apparent that early 20th century practice represents both refinement and continuity. Across continents, across cultures, and across centuries, humans maintain patient curiosity, careful observation, and structured integration of substances into life. The preference for subtle, socially guided, and deliberate shifts in perception is as consistent now as it was in ancient times, a testament to the enduring human understanding of the mind, ritual, and daily life.
As the night continues to settle softly, we move now into the mid-20th century, a time of profound global change. World wars, economic recovery, and expanding communication networks reshape society. Yet humans maintain their centuries-long curiosity about gentle shifts in perception. Substances that subtly alter mood or cognition are now more widely available, but the fundamental principles of patient observation, moderation, and socially guided practice persist across continents and cultures. In the post-war era, tea and coffee continue to dominate daily life in Europe, North America, and Asia. Tea remains a ceremonial and domestic ritual, providing moments of quiet reflection and mild stimulation. Coffee, increasingly available in both urban cafes and domestic kitchens, supports social conversation, intellectual engagement, and alertness in a rapidly modernizing world. Even with faster-paced lifestyles, humans integrate these beverages slowly and deliberately, noting subtle effects on focus, mood, and attention. Chocolate, mass-produced and widely distributed, maintains its role as a source of mild pleasure and gentle stimulation. Confections and beverages offer small, reliable alterations in perception, providing warmth, comfort, and slight elevation of mood. Across homes and social gatherings, chocolate consumption is often ritualized, sipped after a meal, shared with friends, or enjoyed in quiet solitude. Humans continue to observe effects carefully, preserving centuries of practice. Tobacco consumption experiences both expansion and diversification. Cigarettes dominate, but pipes and cigars remain in use. The mild stimulation and relaxation provided by tobacco are balanced by social norms, health awareness, and careful observation. Smoking is often embedded in structured moments, a pause during work, a quiet evening with friends, or a reflective domestic ritual. Across continents, tobacco consumption reflects centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Subtlety, moderation, and social integration remain central. Alcohol continues to serve as a gentle agent of social cohesion, reflection, and minor perception shift. Beer, wine, and distilled spirits are consumed in homes, pubs, and social gatherings with attention to moderation. Temperance movements of the previous century have left a cultural imprint. Humans continue to approach alcohol cautiously, observing dosage and timing, and integrating it into domestic, ceremonial, and communal contexts. Across societies, alcohol remains a reliable, socially guided tool for subtle mental adjustment. The mid-20th century also sees the rise of early subcultures, which begin to experiment more openly with perception-altering substances. While mainstream society continues centuries-old practices with tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, and alcohol, and herbal infusions, subcultures explore new substances, often in small, controlled doses. Despite the novelty, the human principle of observation and moderation persists. These experiments are social, guided, and structured, reflecting millennia of careful practice. In North and South America, coca and caffeine-based beverages gain popularity. Coca leaf derivatives and early soft drinks provide mild stimulation, social enjoyment, and slight mental enhancement. These substances are often consumed in structured domestic or public contexts with awareness of subtle effects. Similarly, coffee and chocolate continue to support reflection, social engagement, and gentle adjustment of attention and mood. Across continents, human patterns remain remarkably consistent, deliberate, patient, and socially integrated experimentation. Herbalism and apothecary practices continue, now supplemented by emerging pharmacology and early chemistry. Mild tinctures, teas, and infusions are consumed for relaxation, comfort, or slight mental adjustment. Manuals, journals, and oral transmission document effects carefully, emphasizing observation, dosage, and social integration. Even with new chemicals and pharmaceutical options, the centuries-old principle of patient, socially guided experimentation continues to dominate. Subtle experimentation also intersects with modern leisure and cultural shifts. Cafes, salons, and domestic rituals support mild stimulation, reflective conversation, and gentle perception shifts. Urban life, while faster-paced, continues to provide spaces for deliberate consumption. A quiet evening with tea, a domestic chocolate ritual, a shared cigarette with friends, or a measured glass of wine. Humans adapt to new contexts without abandoning the principles of observation, moderation, and social guidance. Globalization during this period increases access to traditional and newly introduced substances. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, herbs, and fermented beverages are more widely available than ever before. Indigenous practices continue to coexist with European, Asian, and American traditions, maintaining structured use, ritual observation, and careful integration into daily life. Across continents, humans preserve continuity. Subtle shifts in perception are more effective and meaningful when socially and culturally guided. Scientific documentation expands in this era. Studies observe caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, and herbal compounds systematically, noting effects on mood, focus, and mental clarity. Even as some substances are investigated for medical or recreational purposes, the overarching principle remains centuries old. Patient observation, structured use, and social integration produce reliable and meaningful results. humans continue to discover that gentle, deliberate mental adjustment enhances daily life more sustainably than extremes. Urbanization, industrial work schedules, and post-war recovery increase the need for structured, mild mental adjustment. Tea breaks, coffee rituals, chocolate consumption, and tobacco pauses provide moments of calm, reflection, and subtle alertness. Alcohol, integrated into social or domestic gatherings, remains a tool for gentle perception adjustment. Across cities and homes, humans continue centuries of practice. Observation, integration, and moderation guide the consumption of substances that shift perception. Cultural production also reflects subtle engagement with mental adjustment. Literature, music, and domestic guides emphasize rituals of tea, coffee, chocolate, and tobacco. Diaries and letters document small shifts in mood, focus, or reflection. Across continents, social, domestic, and ceremonial contexts continue to frame consumption, reinforcing centuries-old human preferences for subtlety, observation, and social guidance. Even as mass media and advertising increase exposure to substances, humans remain remarkably consistent in approach. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, and alcohol are integrated deliberately, consumed in measured doses, and observed for subtle effects. Social norms, domestic routines, and ceremonial practices continue to provide structure, ensuring that experimentation remains safe, effective, and meaningful. Across continents, millennia of accumulated knowledge persist.
Indigenous and traditional knowledge continues to coexist alongside modern experimentation. Communities maintain careful observation, ritualized preparation, and social guidance in the consumption of local plants and fermented beverages. Across continents, humans consistently demonstrate the value of patience, careful observation, and structured integration of perception-altering substances. Subtle shifts are preferred over extremes, and knowledge is transmitted carefully across generations. In leisure, social, and domestic spaces, humans continue to engage with mild perception-altering substances in structured ways. Tea rooms, cafes, salons, and domestic partners serve as spaces for reflection, conversation, and observation of effects. Chocolate, coffee, tea, tobacco, and moderate alcohol remain central tools for gentle mental adjustment. Across continents and social classes, observation, patience, and social guidance continue to define practice. The mid-20th century also introduces early experimentation with new psychoactive substances among select groups, often in small, controlled doses. Despite novelty, centuries-old principles persist: careful observation, structured social context, moderation, and deliberate integration into daily or ceremonial life. Across time and space, humans demonstrate remarkable continuity in their approach to subtle shifts in perception. Imagine softly a quiet evening in a mid-20th century city. Lamplight or early electric lighting illuminates streets and homes. Cafes and salons hum quietly. Tea and coffee are prepared with care. Chocolate is enjoyed in measured amounts. Tobacco smoke drifts lazily, and mild alcohol punctuates conversation. Patrons sip, observe, reflect, and integrate gentle shifts in perception into domestic and social life. Across continents, centuries of accumulated human knowledge continue seamlessly. Even with global distribution, industrial production, and emerging subcultures, the principle remains unchanged. Subtle mental adjustment is most effective when observed carefully, integrated socially, and consumed deliberately. Across continents, generations, and centuries, humans continue to prefer measured, socially guided, and structurally integrated experimentation. Urbanization, globalization, scientific observation, and cultural shifts have expanded access,
but the fundamental human approach to subtle perception-altering substances remains consistent. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, herbal infusions, and alcohol continue to provide mild stimulation, reflection, and social cohesion. Observation, patience, and structured integration guide consumption across cultures and centuries. Across homes, cafes, salons, apothecaries, and indigenous communities, centuries of accumulated knowledge persist. Subtle mental adjustment remains central to human experience. Tea, coffee, chocolate, tobacco, herbal infusions, and alcohol are consumed deliberately, observed carefully, and integrated socially. Across continents and time, humans maintain remarkable continuity in approach, patient, deliberate, and structured exploration of perception. The mid-20th century illustrates refinement, globalization, and subtle expansion. Humans combine centuries of accumulated knowledge with industrial production, increased global access, and emerging social experimentation. Across continents and social strata, centuries-old principles persist: patience, observation, social guidance, and deliberate integration of perception-altering substances into life. Even amid rapid technological, cultural, and social change, humans preserve ancient principles. Gentle, socially guided, and structured shifts in perception continue to enhance reflection, social cohesion, and daily life. Across continents, centuries, and cultures, the patient, deliberate, and socially integrated approach to mental adjustment remains a defining feature of human experience.